Josh, thank you for the kind introduction. Let me start, first of all, by apologizing in advance for a cough I have. It's unpredictable. I can't control it. I hope it goes well. I'd like to thank the University Republicans for inviting me. I'd like to say how special it is for me to come back to the University of Chicago, where I taught for 4 years in the late 70s and early 80s, and what a special place this was for me. What a wonderful time I had here. My topic tonight is Confronting Radical Islam, and I'd like to start by, well, first I'll speak fairly short so there's plenty of time for back and forth Q&A. I'd like to start by framing the issue. What exactly is the problem we're facing? And I'll do that by quoting four different institutions or individuals on two different sides. First, the Defense Department recently indicated that, quote, it prefers to avoid using the term long war or global war on terror. Instead, it said, please use overseas contingency operation. Janet Napolitano, the new Secretary of Homeland Security, did not use overseas contingency operation, but rather she called it man-caused disasters, and said she was using this term to get away from the politics of fear. The U.S. Center for National Counterterrorism gave advice to other parts of the government not to use terms such as Islam, Caliphate, Jihad, or Mujahideen. Do mention Al-Qaeda, violent extremism, and terrorism. And finally, Jackie Smith, who is the the Home Secretary, the same as Interior Minister in Great Britain, said there's nothing Islamic about the wish to terrorize, nothing Islamic about plotting murder, pain, and grief. Indeed, if anything, these actions are anti-Islamic. That's one category. The other category starts with the U.S. Central Command, which says while there is concern that we not label all Muslims as Islamist terrorists, it is proper to address certain aspects of violence as uniquely Islamic. Second, Antonin Scalia, Justice of the Supreme Court, said America is at war with radical Islamists. Third, John McCain said during the campaign, we are facing the transcendent challenge of the 21st century, and that is radical Islamic extremism. Finally, fourth, Barack Obama, in his speech on race a year ago in Philadelphia, he referred to the perverse and hateful ideologies of radical Islam. So you have two very different visions here. One could be summarized as man-caused disasters or overseas contingency operations, and the other as war with radical Islamists, transcendent challenge of radical Islamic extremism. I think this is a very important debate. I think it's very important that one know what one thinks, because we are at war. And just as a physician cannot treat a disease without being able first to identify and name it, so a strategist cannot win a war unless he is able first to identify and name the enemy. And clearly, from what you see here, all authoritative voices, important voices, parts of the same government indeed, there's no consensus, there's no understanding. And I'd say this is not just 8 years after 9/11, but it's really 30 years after the Iranian Revolution. We still don't quite know who we're fighting. What is the topic here? So what I'd like to do is four things in the course of the next few minutes. One, to give my understanding of who the enemy is. Two, to analyze how dangerous this enemy is. Three, to look at its methods. And four, to offer some thoughts about our policies. Now, the debate over who the enemy is has three different vantage points and three different arguments in the United States. One is what the first list represented, which is that terrorism is the enemy. And perhaps the most clear statement of this was by Colin Powell one day after 9/11, Secretary of State. He said, the atrocities of the day before should not be seen as something done by Arabs or what he called Islamics. It was done by terrorists. It was done by terrorists. Nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Arabs, terrorists. This is by and large the government point of view, the media point of view, the academy's point of view. I disagree First of all, terrorism is a tactic, not an enemy. Secondly, it's euphemistic. Thirdly, it's inaccurate. There are plenty of terrorists who have nothing to do with this problem, and this problem could well have non-terroristic aspects. Should Iran get nuclear weapons, that's not terrorism. It's something quite different. I reject that. I also reject what I'll call the third point of view, jumping over the second, which is not the establishment like the first one. It's rather the insurgent point of view that says Islam, the religion of Islam, is the problem. This is a point of view that had no traction in the United States a decade ago and now is really very present. There are books, there are articles, there are talk show hosts, television hosts, blogs, so forth, making the argument that Islam has been the enemy of the West for 1400 years, has not changed, will not change. Jihad and the like are permanent, are unchanging, and we must see Muslims, Islam and Muslims, as the enemy. As the enemy. I disagree with this as well. And for several reasons. First of all, it's ahistorical. It's taking the present moment and assuming that the past and the future will be the same as today. It'd be like looking at Nazi Germany in 1942 and saying Germany has always been Nazi or proto-Nazi. Goethe, Schiller, you name it, were part of the Nazi preparation. And there's a 1,000-year Reich coming up, and Germany will always be Nazi. Well, no. Germany was Nazi for 12 years. The Muslim world is going through a very difficult, very radical moment. It has not always been like this. When I began my career in this field in the late 60s, no one talked about Islam. It was all about Arab socialism and things like that. There's no talk of Islam. Radical Islam was not an issue. Jihad was not an issue. So just as things change in the last 40 years, they can change very much they will change in the next 40 years. So it's wrong to take the present moment and extrapolate it backwards and forwards. Secondly, if one says that all Muslims are enemies, one is taking friends and potential friends and turning them into enemies. There are plenty of Muslims who do not like the Islamist phenomenon. Indeed, Muslims have been the primary victims. For example, in Algeria, where 150,000 Muslims were killed in the 1990s, in the course of an insurgency. Darfur, generally considered to be the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, is Islamist Muslims against other Muslims. Hundreds of thousands, millions perhaps dead. Muslims are not all supporters of radical Islam. Finally, if one says that Islam is what it is and will never change, then how can there be a solution to the problem? In other words, if Islam is unchanging, where comes the solution? If one gives up on Muslims, what can one hope for in the future? And I have this argument often with people who say Islam that will never change, it's what it is today, and that's it. And I say, well, what is the solution? What is U.S. policy to be? They can't answer. What is U.S. policy to be if Islam, that's the fourth point, if Islam is the enemy? We can't have a policy. We're not a crusader state. We're not a Christian state. We can't go and convert people. We can't fight a religious war. So, practically speaking, intellectually speaking, saying Islam is the enemy is wrong. The third, or the second position, the one I skipped over, I've signaled to you what my views are. It's radical Islam. It's a form of Islam. It's totalitarian Islam. It's extremist Islam. It's